Leningrad in winter of 1942. The besieged city is starving and every calorie could mean the difference between life and death. It's hard to imagine anything as valuable as food in a city where people were dying of hunger every day. But there was something else, something that could be traded, something that could offer a moment of relief, something that for many was just as important as food. Well, what do you think it was? One survivor, Nina Mikhailovna, later recalled in her memoirs that her father had 2 packs of cigarettes left. He didn't smoke, but he kept them hidden. One day he told her, "Nina, today we trade." And they went to the market, a place where people whispered and dealt in the shadows. Her father found a man, an officer, who had access to extra rations. Very important. He pulled out the cigarettes, and the officer hesitated, then nodded. In exchange, they got half a loaf of bread, and that night her little brother finally ate. Her father looked at her and said, "See, sometimes a cigarette is worth more than gold." And that's true. On the Eastern Front, cigarettes weren't just tobacco and paper. They were survival. They were the currency, and for many, they were the only reminder of the distant comforts of a life before war. But how did tobacco become so valuable? What did people actually smoke when there were no cigarettes left? And how did the war change smoking forever? Let's find out. At Ashes and Archives, we believe that history is more than just polished stories found in textbooks and government-approved accounts. The real story of World War II lives in the first-hand experiences of those who endured its battles, occupations, losses and scars. These personal histories are not always pretty, and some of the content I want to share simply doesn't fit within YouTube's guidelines. I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. You'll find the link in the video description, or you can scan the QR code on your screen to visit our website. Subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you, and let's continue. Before the war, smoking was a daily habit for millions of Soviet men. Nearly every urban worker, soldier, and intellectual smoked. More than 80% of all processed tobacco went into making so-called papirosy, a uniquely Russian type of a cigarette with a short tobacco column and a long, hollow cardboard mouthpiece. These weren't the filtered cigarettes of the West. Papirosy were unfiltered, strong, and hit hard. 2 brands were especially popular. Belomorkanal, introduced in 1932 to commemorate the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal, was cheap, strong, and found pretty much everywhere. It was the go-to smoke for workers, soldiers, and anyone who needed a quick, harsh puff. Then there was Kazbek, a premium papirosa made with high-quality Caucasian tobacco. It was smoother, richer, and more expensive. Often smoked by officers and intellectuals, and those, of course, who could afford the taste of luxury. If you saw a man smoking Belomorkanal, he was probably, well, a factory worker or a soldier. If he had Kazbek, he was likely an officer. Before the war, most Soviet tobacco came from the south. Krasnodar Krai and Rostov Oblast were the leading producers with their warm climate, providing ideal conditions for growing tobacco. Ukraine and Crimea were also major sources, especially for Mahorka, a strong, coarse-cut tobacco that was popular among the working class. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the tobacco supply collapsed almost overnight. The Nazis occupied Ukraine and Crimea, cutting off nearly half of the country's tobacco production. Suddenly, cigarettes, once an everyday item, became a rare luxury. To make matters worse, many tobacco factories stopped making cigarettes and were converted to serve the war effort. The Leningrad tobacco factory was repurposed to produce gas mask filters during the siege, and Moscow tobacco factory, known for making Kazbek, shifted from rolling papirosy to packing gunpowder and producing cartridge cases. The Kharkov tobacco factory never had the chance to convert. It was completely destroyed during the German invasion in late 1941. At the start of the war, the Red Army didn't issue tobacco rations. Soldiers were on their own when it came to finding something to smoke, and they got desperate. Some dug through dirt and ash looking for old cigarette butts to re-roll whatever tobacco was left inside, while others turned to substitutes, smoking dried leaves, moss, or even tea leaves, just to mimic sensation of smoking. Well, can you imagine yourself doing that? When rolling paper ran out, they used whatever was available, including propaganda leaflets. This was strictly illegal, but desperate times called for desperate measures. And one Soviet soldier, Alexei Zubov, later recalled an incident at the front. A German leaflet fell near his trench. It promised food and warm shelter for anyone who surrendered. He laughed and tore it up, and rolled his last bit of Mahorka in it. When his officer saw, he nearly had him arrested for misuse of propaganda material. By 1942, the situation had become so bad that the Soviet High Command had no choice. They finally introduced official tobacco rations to keep morale from totally collapsing. But just like food, tobacco wasn't handed out equally. Some got proper cigarettes, others received rough-cut Mahorka, and many still had to trade, bag, or steal just to get anything to smoke. By 1942, tobacco became part of the Soviet soldiers' daily ration. But like everything else, in the army, not everyone got the same quality. High-ranking officers and pilots received the best tobacco. They got the factory-made papirosy like Kazbek or Belomorkanal, while regular infantrymen were issued Mahorka. But they didn't get it in cigarettes. They were given loose tobacco in small pouches and had to roll it themselves, usually in old newspaper. Rear echelon troops had it the worst. Most of them were lucky if they got anything at all. One Soviet soldier summed it up perfectly. You could spot an officer by his cigarette. A factory-made papirosy? He was important. And Mahorka rolled in old newspaper? Just another grunt. By 1943, Soviet soldiers started seeing something unexpected in their supplies. American cigarettes. As part of the Lend-Lease program, the US wasn't just sending tanks and planes and food, they were also sending cartons of cigarettes. Brands like Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, and Old Gold made their way into the USSR, arriving through the Arctic convoy in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, or through the Persian corridor via Iran. But did regular Soviet soldiers ever get their hands on them? Well, not really. Most American cigarettes went to officers and pilots. If frontline troops saw them, it was usually through trading or the black market. Some captured German soldiers even traded American cigarettes for food. That's how valuable they were. A Soviet tanker, Sergei Kovalov, remembered the first time he tried one. The first time I smoked an American cigarette, I thought this is what generals must smoke. Smooth and rich, not like our Mahorka that burned like gunpowder. Joseph Stalin was rarely seen without his pipe, but while he looked like a man who smoked regular pipe tobacco, what he actually smoked was something else entirely. His preferred tobacco was Herzegovina Floor, a high-quality cigarette tobacco. Instead of smoking it like a cigarette, he would break it open and loaded into his pipe. Herzegovina Floor wasn't something an ordinary Soviet citizen could buy. It was reserved almost exclusively for Stalin and the senior Soviet leadership. But by using it in his pipe, Stalin maintained the image of a man of the people while still enjoying the finer quality of cigarette tobacco. Occasionally he also smoked other tobaccos, including American brands like Edgeworth Sliced, but Herzegovina Floor remained his favorite. Whether it was for the taste or just another way to control his image, Stalin's pipe wasn't just a habit, it was part of his persona, that's for sure. The war left the Soviet Union with millions of lives lost and a nation full of soldiers and civilians who had turned to tobacco to cope with stress. Smoking became part of a daily life, and by the early 2000s, nearly 60% of Russian men were still smokers. It wasn't until more recent years that this number started to drop, finally falling below 50% by 2014. For decades after the war, smoking remained deeply ingrained in Soviet society. It was a habit that the war had only made stronger. For Soviet soldiers, a cigarette wasn't just tobacco. Just like I said in the beginning of this video, it was 5 minutes of peace in hell. At Ashes and Archives, we know that history isn't just about dry facts and textbook stories. It's about real people, real moments, and the untold details that make the past feel alive. World War II is one of the most studied events in history, but there are so many surprising, weird, and fascinating stories that don't always make it into the mainstream narrative. From daily lives of soldiers to the unexpected ways war shaped our culture, we're here to explore the lighter, lesser-known, and sometimes downright strange side of history. If you love history that's engaging, casual, and not just the same old battles and dates every time, subscribe to the channel and join us as we take a fresh look at the past. Hit subscribe now, and let's dig into some incredible stories together.